Tonight, in this calm space where your mind can drift slowly and peacefully, I'd like to take you back to one of the most quietly surreal and strangely gentle-sounding historical events in the United States. It is an event which, on paper, almost feels humorous, almost whimsical, almost cartoonish in the way the premise sounds, but the truth of it was real. And the event was one of the most unexpected, bizarre industrial accidents in early 20th century American history. And yet, despite the way people retell it today with a touch of disbelief, the story itself gently asks to be told slowly, patiently, like a strange dream from another lifetime. This is the story of the Boston molasses flood of 1919, where a quiet winter day suddenly shifted into something that would be remembered for generations, not because it was loud or fiery or explosive in the way we imagine disasters normally to be, but because it involved a substance that feels harmless, childlike, nostalgic molasses. A sticky, sweet syrup used in baking, candy, and simple kitchen comfort, suddenly at the center of a slow, heavy tidal wave that reshaped a neighborhood. We begin in the north end of Boston, one of the older, dense, lively districts of the city. In the early 1900s, it was a place of industry as much as community. Evenings smelled of the harbor, the salted air, wood from the working docks, coal heat, and at times, the warm scent of baking or brewing that drifted from factories and warehouses. People knew each other. People walked everywhere. And like many immigrant-dense areas along the U.S. coastline, the sounds of many languages and cultures could be heard along the narrow, winding streets. This neighborhood lived with a kind of grounded, real, working rhythm. Ships arrived, goods were unloaded, wagons carried supplies, men went to work, families walked to corner shops, and the days passed with a steady beat. The large molasses storage tank at the center of this story belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. It was a massive steel tank that dominated the view near Commercial Street. The tank was roughly 50 feet high and 90 feet wide, and inside it was held over 2 million gallons of molasses. Molasses in that era wasn't just used for food. Molasses was a key raw ingredient for producing industrial alcohol used in munitions, manufacturing, chemical processes, and industrial supply chains that fed into the pace of wartime and post-wartime needs. At the time, the United States was transitioning out of the WWI period, and demand pressures for alcohol processing were tremendous. The molasses in the tank was valuable, industrially important, economically meaningful, and that tank stood there, quietly, without anyone in daily life thinking much about it. But for years before the flood, the tank was poorly constructed. It leaked. People in the neighborhood sometimes joked that children could scoop spilled molasses from the ground around the tank. They said the tank groaned sometimes as the liquid shifted. That giant steel tank wasn't a truly stable, and though multiple internal warnings existed at different times, in that era, in that economic climate, and within that industrial structure, the tank kept being used anyway. Today, engineers would immediately point toward stress testing, steel thickness thresholds, welding inspection standards, structural load assessments, and safety oversight requirements, all the things modern industry uses to prevent something like this from happening. But in that moment in history, such standards were not fully built out yet, and the tank simply remained not in dramatic peril, not in publicly feared instability, just quietly compromised in a way nobody could see until it was too late. The day of the flood was January 15th, 1919. The temperature in Boston had recently shifted from unusually cold weather to a sudden, slight warm-up. The sun was gentle, but enough warmth now pressed against the steel tank to change the internal pressure dynamic inside. Inside that giant barrel of molasses, fermentation and heat were increasing internal pressure. Some historians believe that thermal expansion plus fermentation gas buildup created a kind of perfect timing. The steel plates already too thin, rivets already strained, weld joints that were never fully adequate were now being pushed to their limit silently. No alarms, no urgent signals, no signs that an irreversible moment was minutes away. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, with no dramatic precursor, the tank collapsed, completely, without warning. The steel walls ripped apart in multiple directions, and 2 million gallons of thick, heavy molasses surged outward. The initial wave of molasses was estimated to move at roughly 35 miles per hour. It is hard to imagine that speed with something so slow in our minds, but thick syrup, under massive weight and pressure, moves like liquid concrete. The wave reached as high as 25 feet as it poured out onto streets, between buildings, slamming into structures, trapping horses, smashing small walls, and sending debris in multiple directions. The sound was described like a giant roar mixed with twisting steel, and then, almost instantly, a muffled, heavy silence. The strange, surreal quality of this disaster comes from the way molasses behaves. Unlike water, swift and able to dissipate, molasses held onto everything it touched. It coated the ground like a heavy blanket. It thickened and clogged streets. Men trying to move in it found their legs weighted down. People became stuck in it. Animals found themselves unable to free themselves. Buildings pushed off their foundations, tilted and collapsed. Firefighters who tried to move into the area were slowed dramatically. Rescue efforts required hacksaws, ropes, shovels, teams of helpers, and patience. Reports said that even days later, molasses still coated boots and clothing. The smell remained for months. And for decades after, people swore that on hot summer days, you could still catch the faint, sweet smell of molasses in cracks and old brick. The human loss from this event was real, and there were injuries, property destruction, extensive cleanup, and legal consequences. But in this quiet retelling for sleep, we skip the violent pain and hold to the calm, reflective historical lens. This strange disaster was unlike any other American industrial accident. It was a reminder that not all industrial risks look like explosions or flames. Some come in slow, heavy, sticky form that no one imagined could be dangerous until the moment it was. Investigations after the flood revealed negligence, poor steel quality, rushed construction, lack of proper testing. The tank simply should not have been built the way it was built. And from that point forward, industrial safety regulation began changing, slowly, steadily. Lessons were learned, standards evolved. A strange accident helped drive part of a future system that would keep thousands safer. And this is one of the subtle, almost poetic patterns of history that quiet tragedies shape future safety in ways that become invisible to most people, but very real in long-term legacy. Tonight, in this retelling, we let the noise and urgency fade. We simply imagine the North End as it is now, modern, filled with restaurants, coffee shops, neighborhood apartments, and warm nighttime sidewalks. We imagine the way history lives underneath cities, not just in monuments, but in stories, in small plaques, in archival notes. in a quiet sense of this place remembers. Boston remembers this flood not as spectacle, but as a unique moment where the strange and the ordinary collided. And more than 100 years later, the city still holds the memory in calm acknowledgement. History is full of loud stories, but it is also full of soft, odd stories like this. Stories that ask you to slow down and examine how the smallest overlooked engineering choice can ripple outward in unexpected waves. Stories that sound unbelievable and yet happened exactly as recorded. Stories that now can lull the mind rather than shock it. Stories like the Boston molasses flood live in the gentle category of American strangeness, odd, factual, and perfect for reflection at a very slow pace. So as you let this story settle, allow it to become soft. Allow the edges of it to dissolve into the quiet of your room. The event is over. The cleanup is done. The lesson is absorbed. We are simply reflecting from a safe distance, knowing that sometimes history is sweet, strange, and slow in a way that lends itself perfectly to sleep. Let your thoughts drift with that calm perspective, and let the mind loosen, unhurried, like molasses cooling quietly in winter night air. The day is complete. You can rest now. For our second story tonight, if you're comfortable and the room is a little dim, I'd like to take you on a slow walk along country roads in Ohio, the kind that bend past fields and barns and then keep going until they find a creek. Picture a late summer evening, the kind of light that grows simple and gold as it slides down the clouds. Corn stands tall, soybeans breathe close to the ground, and beyond them, in neat quilted patches, rows of potatoes rest under their green tops. A farm dog lifts its head and then drifts back to sleep. A barn swallow tips the air and is gone. In this quiet, a gentle story waits about thrift and curiosity, about a flavor that once caught on as a small, practical fad. It is the story of Ohio's potato whiskey. I am going to tell it the slow way so you can relax. We'll keep to simple steps: planting, harvest, a cellar, a kettle, and a handful of patient hands who believed that if a potato could be mashed, perhaps it could be coaxed into something that warmed you on a cold night. This is not a tale of roaring speakeasies or headline scandal. It is a porch light history, told with the soft breath of the countryside and the steady pace of chores done well. If you feel yourself drifting in and out as we go, that's perfectly all right. The story will wait for you, the way a fence post waits in a field under the moon. Begin in the late 1800s and ease forward into the early years of the 20th century. Ohio was and is a practical place. Farms stitched together towns, and towns stitched together counties, and it all held with the thread of markets and fairs and shared work. Potatoes suited the rhythm, dependable to grow, useful in the kitchen, hard to waste. In bumper years, when the harvest came in heavy and the bins in cool cellars grew full, families looked for ways to stretch the crop's value without rushing. A good farmer, after all, is a steward of time as much as soil. There were already traditions of grain spirits, corn, whiskey, and rye carried through families and communities. But every so often, someone raised the question in a store or at a grange meeting. If potatoes could be turned into starches, and starches into sugar with a bit of coaxing and heat, why not try a gentle spirit? Not for extravagance, simply because the potato was there in such kindly abundance. The idea didn't explode. It drifted. A neighbor tried it. An uncle had a notes-filled ledger. A page of a newspaper offered advice clipped from somewhere else, and slowly, a small fad stirred among cellar stairs and barn doors. More whisper than shout, more experiment than enterprise. To understand the feeling of it, imagine planting in spring. The soil is cool and the sky generous with clouds. You walk the rows with seed pieces in a pail, press them into furrows, and listen to the soft, hollow sound of earth falling back into place. Weeks pass. Rains come. The plants push upward, dark green at first, then a little dusty from summer winds. The work is measured cultivating, checking for beetles, mending a stone-nicked hoe. By the time the plants bloom with those shy, pale flowers, a good season has begun to smell like itself. Damp leaf, sun-warmed soil, the faint sweetness of new growth. Harvest is slower than one might imagine. People pull the vines, loosen the earth, and then, kneeling, gather potatoes by hand, brushing away clingy dirt. Wooden crates fill with a pleasant thump. The potatoes go to cool places, cellars, sheds, storerooms. The air down there is always the same. A little cool, a little dry, with a scent of timber and thyme. Lantern light glows on stone walls. You set aside the best for immediate cooking, the knobbly ones for soup and mash. And then, if you are inclined toward thrift and curiosity, you keep a few baskets for projects. In Ohio, for a whisper of years, one of those projects was potato whiskey. The tools were ordinary: a big pot for mashing, a wash tub or barrel for fermenting, a simple copper or tin still for the careful heating and cooling that turns vapor back to liquid. The process asked for patience more than skill. Heat the potatoes and break them down. Introduce a bit of malt or enzymes to nudge starches toward fermentable sugars. Cool the mash to a friendly temperature and add yeast to set the quiet world of bubbles in motion. Even the most talkative neighbor lowers his voice in a cellar like this, because fermenting mash feels like listening to something sleep and breathe. No two families used the exact same method. Some swore by russets, others by yellow potatoes, and a few by whatever the field gave that year. Water from a particular well mattered, and so did a careful hand with temperature. The difference between too warm and just right is small but meaningful. Too hot, and the yeast grows flustered. Too cool, and it dozes off before the work is done. The days pass in soft checks. Lift the burlap, peek at the foam, lay your palm on the barrel to feel the faint living warmth within. No need to rush. The cellar and the yeast keep time together, as old friends do. When fermentation calmed, the still came forward from the corner, polished enough to please the eye. It was not elaborate. A kettle, a cap or head, a length of tubing, and a coil set in a tub of cool water. Heat is applied gently. A sweet, earthy scent, part bread, part steam, part the low memory of the field, begins to gather itself. It is not the sharp smell of a city distillery, nor the heavy reek of a careless run. It is something kindly and domestic, like the air above a pot of soup. At this stage, you hear stories of craft wisdom, the way someone's grandmother said to discard the first drips, the way someone's uncle taught tapping the side of the coil to judge the pace, the way a kettle sings a little at its seam when the run is going well. Yields were modest. Nobody in this story is bragging. That was part of the charm. It was not an industry. It was a season, like putting up jars of peaches or onions. The whisper of a fad, living in the ordinary places of a house. What did potato whiskey taste like? The reports are soft and varied. Some say it was mild and slightly sweet, with an earthy roundness that reminded them of a root cellar on a cold day. Others describe a cleaner taste than expected, something closer to a light grain spirit but with a shy, buttery afterthought. A few admitted that the batch depended a great deal on the hand of the maker and the patience of the process. When a run went right, a small glass at a winter table felt like a useful warmth rather than a celebration. Because Ohio is generous and social at heart, the fad shared itself at the edges of gatherings after a church supper, at the end of a day, at the fairgrounds, on a porch once the cards were put away. Not everyone drank, and in that era the temperance movement was strong. But in those quiet districts where neighbors borrowed tools and returned them polished, where recipes traveled as gossip tucked into an envelope, potato whiskey became a thing one heard of with a smile. Did you try the Collins Place S batch? Mrs. Harlow S. had a touch of clove. Ed says the North Well makes it taste like rain. It would be easy to imagine a harsh fight between the fad and temperance, but in this story we keep to the factual, sleepy edges. Many Ohio towns were careful and courteous. Store windows could hold a temperance poster, and, across the street, a hardware shelf could hold copper fittings for a still, and the two realities shared the sidewalk without raising their voices. In kitchens, people practiced moderation the way they practiced thrift, not as a contest, but as a way of balancing the day's tasks. Sometimes a minister would preach about sobriety on Sunday, and on Monday, he would admire the potatoes laid out on racks in a parishioner's cellar and talk about the weather. The talk was most often practical. Will the river stay high this spring? Did you see the new binder they brought to the Grange? Against this quiet, the potato whiskey fad did not blaze. It glowed. A small, neighborly curiosity that lasted long enough to touch a few winters. If you open an old ledger book or county cookbook from that era, you find a familiar pattern. Recipes written in a tight, patient hand. A custard, a pickled beet. A note about how much soap fat to save by Tuesday. And sometimes, not boldly labeled, a MASH entry containing weights and measures that look like cooking but read like chemistry. 10 pounds potatoes, 2 pounds malt, boil in water, cool to blood warm, yeast, keep covered, do not stir once set, wait. These notes weren't a secret so much as quiet, like a song hummed during chores. People wrote what worked so they could repeat it when the snow came right, and the cellar kept steady. Jars were labeled with fingertip codes, chalk marks, pencil circles, and placed where light didn't reach. The sound in those cellars was the steady sound of a house timbers settling, a mouse investigating a corner, the occasional sigh of wind through a small window. If you lit a lantern and moved carefully, you'd find the coil of the still wrapped in burlap to hold cool, the tub refreshed with chunks of winter ice carried down from the porch. Around it all, shelves of preserves watched with glass-lipped patience. The scene was lovely in its usefulness. Come summer, the county fair unfurled. Horses in harness, pies judged by slice, pumpkins throned on tables. A boy carried a ribbon longer than his arm. Somewhere on the straw gold edge of evening, men in shirt sleeves and women with practical hats sat on benches under a canvas shade and talked about crops that had done well and crops that had sulked. When talk grew technical, it often turned toward the year S potato yields, and for a window of years, someone would gently mention experiments in the cellar. No one bragged about alcohol. It was too ordinary and too private for that. But someone might say, a controlled mash beats a hurried one, and someone else would nod as if they were discussing biscuits. In those circles, you'd hear tiny innovations, the way cooler water coaxed a mellow edge, the way resting the spirit in a jar with a small apple chip softened the corners, the way one neighbor's place gave a mysterious vanilla scent no one could replicate. Not every county had a pot still tucked away, and not every person wanted a taste. But the fad belonged to conversation, and conversation belongs to fairs, and so, in memory, these things sit together gently as if they always had. History is always quietly changing its hat. By the late 1910s and into 1920, national prohibition arrived wearing the clothes of law and idealism. In this calm account, we want to heighten the drama. Instead, we notice how ordinary households adjusted their shelves. Some people gave up all spirits without pause. Others understood that the law allowed certain industrial and medicinal alcohols, and a few who had learned to tend a clean, careful still turned their attention to legal supplies, flavorings, extracts, and fuel alcohol for lamps and small engines. The potato whiskey fad, to the extent it ever rose enough to be named, eased back into the cellars, and then over a handful of seasons, faded as practical life found other projects. By the time Prohibition ended, farming itself had shifted. Refrigeration and trucking created new patterns. Hybrid seeds changed yields. Families moved toward towns, and towns leaned a little more toward the road than the rail. Potato spirits, in those places where they had briefly warmed January tables, became a story rather than a practice. Old kettles were polished and hung in barns, where they reflected sun in spring and held spider webs by August. What remains of a fad like this is not a trademark or a headline. It is a way a person remembers a smell in a cellar or a note on a recipe card written in someone's mother's hand. It is a pair of copper fittings wrapped in a cloth, in a drawer that no one opens often. It is a sentence at a reunion. Do you remember the time Uncle Will tried potato whiskey? Followed by that round, soft laugh that people share when the memory is better than the result ever was. On some Ohio back roads, if you drive slowly and watch the barns, you can still see a shape on a wall where a kettle once rested. The wood has aged around it, leaving a shy outline. In a market, you might meet someone who says their grandmother always swore by yellow potatoes if she was going to put them to work. If you listen kindly, the stories will come to you without effort, because stories like to land where there is time to hear them. The potato whiskey fad likes that sort of landing. In the end, the charm of the Ohio potato whiskey fad is not in the spirit itself, but in the care. To make anything gently bred, a chair, a quilt, a batch of soap, or a small run of spirits, is to join a long, calm river of skill that moves through families without much noise. The person who taps a coil to judge a rhythm is a cousin to the person who checks a loaf by its hollow sound, and both are kin to the farmer who pinches a leaf and knows if the plant is content. When we describe the fad, we are really describing this river of care and how it makes a home out of labor. So if you are still with me, picture once more the cellar, steady and cool. A small lamp, a coil, wrapped like a sleeping snake, the faint sound of something gently changing state. Outside, on the night air, crickets hold to their measured notes. The lantern's light touches the stone and the jars and one pair of hands resting for a moment on a wooden bench. The air smells faintly of earth and the idea of sweetness. The person on the bench is not in a hurry. They never were. That is why the work turned out as well as it did. In a country that has known great booms and great strictures, loud inventions and quiet seasons, this little story sits modestly and hums. The Great Ohio Potato Whiskey fad did not change the map or the law. It did not even entirely know its own name. It came like a friendly idea in winter, kept good company for a few years, and then went back to sleep in the cellars. If you pass a farmhouse at dusk and see, through an open door, the square dark mouth of a basement, you might imagine it breathing, and in that breath you might hear the low echo of the old experiments, the gentle patience of people using what they had. That is enough for tonight. You can rest now. Let the road outside your window become as quiet as those Ohio fields after harvest. Let the lights fall to embers. If the mind wants to wander, it can walk the rows and come to the cellar stairs and sit for a while in the cool, listening to the calm work of time. When morning comes, if you remember anything, let it be only a kindness, that people in many places have found peaceful ways to turn abundance into warmth, and that even small, forgotten fads can leave a soft glow that lasts a very long time. Tonight's third story. Settle yourself into a comfortable place and let your breath become slow and easy. I'd like to take you to a very small American town that once decided, for reasons both practical and gently amusing, that chewing gum should be banned for 30 days. Not forever, not as condemnation, not with outrage or intensity, just for a temporary experiment in civility, tidiness, and a sense of shared order. It was the kind of decree that wasn't born in anger, but in the kind of mild curiosity that makes a community wonder what daily life would feel like if one small familiar habit were paused. This is one of those soft oddities of American history. One of those quiet, slightly funny, truly real moments that happened in a small place for a short time, and then drifted out of focus like a daydream half remembered the next morning. The town itself sat between two other towns most people had heard of, which is how many small towns are positioned in life. It had a post office with a front bell that rang gently when the door opened, a general store that carried everything from lamp wicks to hard candy, a barber shop that always had one extra chair, even when it didn't need one, and a Methodist church that rang on Sundays and hosted potlucks in the spring. There were only a few paved streets and several gravel ones, and at certain times of the year, more bicycles passed on them than cars. There was no grand city politics here, just humble local concerns handled by neighbors who all knew each other by first name. In this quiet place, the gum ban is not dramatic. It is simply a small episode. Like the time a stray goat got temporarily honorary citizenship at a county fair, or the time the mayor declared the third Saturday of June to be Pie Appreciation Day, which, to be fair, actually made more sense to everyone than the ban did. But we will move slowly and kindly into the story because this is a sleep story, and the goal is not to excite the mind, it is to gently guide it into a cozy drift, where small historical details become like soft stepping stones, leading toward deep rest. To understand how this happened, you need to picture the town as it normally functioned before the ban. Each morning, the sidewalks warmed slowly in sunlight as people walked to the general store, dropped mail at the post office, or simply sat on benches outside and commented on the weather. Children walked to school in groups, swinging lunch pails and talking about their favorite ice cream flavors. Old-timers played checkers outside the barbershop and quietly assessed the pattern of clouds like they were reading a secret weather code. Chewing gum was not something anyone ever thought twice about. Gum lived in small paper packs, tucked in pockets, snack drawers, and purses. It was the sort of thing a cashier offered as change if a customer was a penny and a smile short. Kids chewed it in the playground, and adults chewed it while sitting on porches thinking about the garden. Gum was so normal that it wasn't even noticed until it was. It started in the spring, a very mild spring, the kind where the rain settles kindly rather than inconveniently. A visiting cousin came to stay for a week, and as she traveled around town, she pointed out how often she saw pieces of gum stuck to street corners, fences, telephone poles, and worst of all, the sidewalk in front of the general store. Now, she never meant this as harsh criticism. She simply voiced it as a casual observation. For such a clean little town, you have a surprising amount of gum stuck everywhere. The sentence was tossed lightly, like a pebble dropped in a still pond. But the thing about a still pond is that ripples grow, even from small things. Within 2 days, 3 other townspeople mentioned gum under their shoes, and suddenly, gum was noticed. The storekeeper wiped down his front step and found 4 flattened pieces. The barber stepped out one afternoon and found 2 wads beneath the checkerboard table someone had left from the night before. At Sunday potluck, a lady who baked lemon squares admitted she got gum stuck on the bottom of her pie carrier the previous week. These were very small annoyances, infinitesimal really. But together they formed a pattern. And in small towns, patterns often lead to ideas. The town held community meetings once a month in the church basement. They were always polite, inoffensive, and remarkably calm affairs. Coffee urns steamed gently, folding chairs clacked softly as they were opened and placed in rows. Everyone spoke with turn-taking and good humor. When the matter of gum was raised that evening, no one laughed. They considered it. They weighed it. Not in the sense of moral judgment or outrage, but in the sense that if a community wants to test something, it can simply decide to try it. One woman suggested more trash cans near the store. A gentleman suggested politely worded posters. The mayor, who had a good-natured fondness for unusual civic experiments, suggested a short ban not as punishment or law enforcement exercise, but as a social experiment in courtesy. Just 30 days, 1 month, a little reset button, a chance to see what the sidewalks would look like afterward. Everyone agreed to this with a surprising amount of gentle enthusiasm. So, the town banned chewing gum for 30 days. Handwritten notices were taped on doors of shops carefully lettered in neat script. For 30 days, no chewing gum in town. Testing improved tidiness and courtesy. Thank you kindly. There were no fines, no enforcement patrols, no indignation, just a shared sense of letting the experiment play out. Some kids found it funny. They imagined gum being spoken about in hushed tones like a secret black market candy. A few adults joked about trading gum like currency, but in truth, the ban was taken quite seriously in the same way people take on Lent or short resets. Everyone just sort of lightly cooperated. For a while, it became more habit to tuck a mint in your cheek instead, or sip water. Even the local teacher remarked that students seemed less distracted in class without gum popping. Within a week, the general store's front steps stayed clean. The sidewalk stayed tidy. The benches remained free of hidden stickiness. Barbershop checker matches proceeded without someone discovering an old wad beneath the table. It was as if the town sighed inwardly with satisfaction. People found the small novelty of mint lozenges and lemon drops surprisingly pleasant. They stood in line at the post office and noticed little details: paint chipping softly on the railing, the gentle dusting of pollen on the porch steps, the delicate pattern of the evening light. Without gum being an option, the tiny sensory patterns of daily life became easier to spot, and this created no hardship, only a kind of tiny delight. The ban was so soft in its implementation and so calmly accepted that it began to feel like it had always been there, even though it was only temporary. As the end of the 30 days approached, the town held another meeting. The coffee urns steamed, the chairs unfolded and clacked softly. People sat in the basement and reflected. Had life improved? Most agreed that they liked the look of the sidewalks. Someone suggested putting small ashtrays near entrances so that gum wrappers wouldn't litter. Someone else suggested annual spring, no gum month, as a helpful tradition. A man who repaired bicycles suggested that the experiment proved that even tiny habits have ripple effects. At the end, they voted. Not on a permanent law, but on something far simpler and far sweeter. That when the ban ended tomorrow, everyone would return to gum chewing as they wished, but now with more mindfulness. The next morning, the signs came down gently. The storekeeper folded his notice and placed it in a drawer where he kept small treasures, old postcards, a funny pencil stub, a photo of a 4th of July parade. Kids at school traded gum like baseball cards again. Little pink bubbles floated in the playground air. But the sidewalks stayed clean. People had developed a subtle habit of being more careful. They wrapped gum before discarding it. They used canned mints alongside gum instead of replacing one with the other. The gentle social experiment had worked in the mildest, most pleasant way possible. What makes this story a perfect sleep story is how small it is. A tiny ordinance, a short pause, a gentle act of community self-adjustment not driven by fear or anger or regulation, but simply by a collective desire to see if something could be slightly nicer. Sometimes American history is all storms, upheaval, invention, and great change. But more often, it is made of small, sincere experiments like this, towns testing ideas the way someone adjusts a curtain to see if the morning light falls better. There is something comforting in knowing that history is not only the story of grand events, it is also the story of tiny, civic curiosity, low stakes, low conflict, quietly successful. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture that little town with its calm streets and tidy sidewalks. Picture the church basement warming with gentle conversation and the sound of chairs unfolding. Picture the handwritten sign taped carefully to the general store door. And know that in the wide fabric of American history, even tiny, strange stories leave their soft threads. You may fall asleep now. Let the hum of your own room feel like a small town evening. The day is complete. And tomorrow, like the lifting of the gum ban, will come kindly and naturally, without need for force or hurry. Tonight we spent time in the quiet corners of American history, corners that are not violent, not terrifying, not overwhelming, just gently unusual. These stories are soft reminders that not all history is loud or monumental. Some of it exists in odd experiments, strange moments, practical curiosity, and tiny civic choices that quietly drift beneath the radar. And sometimes those are the stories that help the mind loosen, soften, and let go. Thank you for spending this time here. If you are already drifting, let yourself drift deeper. There's nothing else required of you now. The mind can rest. The body can quiet. History can fade into the calm darkness. And sleep can come naturally, like a slow tide returning to the shore. Good night.